Good afternoon. I'm Angelica Spanos, and this is the Law and Crime Report, diving into true crime and all legal stories making headlines today. Topping our newscast, first off, new developments with George Floyd's murder case. Floyd's death, which was caught on video and became a part of a rally cry for police brutality across the country. Well, now a Minneapolis judge ruled that the 4 former police officers charged in Floyd's death will be tried at the same time in the same county, all on March 8th. Now, this, of course, is against the defense lawyers' wishes, who argued that the publicity surrounding this high-profile case would just prevent the officers from getting a fair trial, and that they raised safety concerns for the defendants and potential witnesses. The judge ruled that holding a single proceeding for the 4 officers would ensure that jurors understand all of the evidence and the complete picture of Floyd's death. Another big part of this is that the judge granted a defense's request to allow cameras in the courtroom. The identities of the jurors will not be shown publicly, and the panel will be partially sequestered. The defense attorneys also had requested a change of venue. That was denied. Let's take a listen.
Only overdose that killed George Floyd was an overdose of excessive force and racism by the Minneapolis Police Department. Let's just be clear about that. All right, a few more questions.
Mr. Cohn, what do you think about the other arguments made, the push to change the venue? Also,
only goal they have in trying to change venues is to get as many jurors as possible who do not look like George Floyd. They don't want jurors that look like you. No, they do not.
It is a blatant attempt to kill George Floyd a second time. They kill a person and then they assassinate our character. And that will not hold, because everybody saw that video, not just across Minneapolis, not just across Minnesota, not just across America, but all across the world. The whole world is watching. 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 The whole.
All right, joining us today to break all of this down, we have criminal defense attorney Imran Ansari, as well as Dina, trial mediator. Thank you both for joining us today. We got a lot to get to. First off, let's talk about this. This is a big move here. All of the officers being tried together here. This trial, no doubt, going to be very focused on. Imran, I'll come out to you first. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I think, listen, Angelica, on one hand, this is the sort of trial that really calls for a free and open access for the public to the proceedings. It's something that really has polarized the nation, the death of George Floyd. And this trial is going to have a lot of public interest, a lot of public scrutiny. And I think that in order to sort of quell the public's need and desire to know what's going on in this proceeding, in this trial, I think it was a good decision on behalf of the judge to allow cameras into the courtroom. I know here, as media lawyers, if you will, we are going to be excited to see what happens during the course of this trial. In terms of the defense and also for the parties, well, there's a lot of media attention on this. And depending how you look at it, depending on where you're going with the defense, it's either that you want the public scrutiny on it because you think your client will benefit somehow once all the evidence is before the court and the jury and the public, or you don't want it. But as we get from this ruling, I think that we're all going to be gearing up for this trial. There's going to be immense public interest into what's going on there, and perhaps this is a message to the nation that you have spoken, you are outraged, and of course there's the other side which supports the fact that this may have been proper police action. But in any event, this trial is going to be publicized, it's going to be televised, and everyone will be able to have a seat, if you will, inside that courtroom.
Surely. The cameras in the courtroom, obviously very good for us here at the Law and Crime Network, so we'll be able to bring you that trial. Dina, Imran talked about a lot of the positive things about this, but are there challenges, trying all 4 of these police officers together with this particular case?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it is going to probably hurt the officer the least involved, Officer Cow, because the jury's going to hear all of them together, which sometimes the defense doesn't like if one of the defendants was perhaps less involved in a crime, but instead might kind of get lumped in with the rest. And that is a fear when all defendants are tried together. But just one other point about the cameras in the courtroom. I mean, the defendants have a constitutional right to a public trial. It's not just that we as the public want to see it, which is interesting because I feel like nowadays people tend to assume that defendants wouldn't want the publicity, but trials are public because of actually the defendant's right. And as we all know, the most watched criminal trial of all time, O.J. Simpson, in that case, he was acquitted. And that was kind of bolstered the view that cameras in the courtroom did not hurt him. And we always look to how is it going to affect the defendant? If at that time he was convicted, it is possible there would have been a larger conversation around, is publicity hurting a defendant's right, to a fair trial? But because he was acquitted, it actually strengthened this idea of having cameras in the courtroom, and the reason why we have them probably even more now after his trial.
So interesting. Thank you, Dina. We also want to get to listening to George Floyd's family's attorney. He talked about how a big part of this is how his right to breathe was taken away from him. I mean, of course, we're talking about how an officer had a knee on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. Let's listen to his attorney.
I start off by reminding you that W.E. Du Bois said that liberty is defined as the right to breathe. If you understand that quote, you will understand this lawsuit. The city of Minneapolis made choices long ago. They made choices to train their officers in a manner in which is inconsistent with human dignity, inconsistent with human life. Those police officers who knelt on the neck of George Floyd and who knelt on his back also made choices. Those choices that they made lasted 526 seconds. All they had to do is let up on one of those seconds and George Floyd might be alive. Instead, what they did is they removed the choice that George Floyd had to live or die. They removed the choice that George Floyd, that he was begging, pleading for the right to breathe, something that our brains do without even thinking. George said please numerous times. Had those police officers listened once, known that the right to breathe is liberty, George Floyd would be alive. We would not be standing here before you today. Every second, every tick of that clock was a constitutional violation against George Floyd. Every tick of the clock was one more moment that George Floyd was not free to leave. Every tick of the clock was one more moment that George Floyd was closer to death because his choice for life was being removed from him because of the unconstitutionality of the training that Minneapolis had taught their officers over years and years, that it was okay to kneel on the neck of unrestrained or restrained, nonviolent, compliant offenders. And George Floyd was all of those, except that he never gave up a fundamental right to breathe. That was taken away from him.
All right, so we hear George Floyd's family attorney there talking a lot about the right to breathe, his right to life, things of that nature. And Imran, when you're listening to that and thinking of this legally as a criminal defense attorney, where are they going with that? And what's their strategy, I guess, by bringing that up? How will that play on later in this trial?
Well, I think, Angelica, that's more speaking towards the civil case, and what we sort of get a glimpse as to what's going to be happening and what's going to be put forth before a court or a pleading and a complaint on the civil case. As a defense attorney, in terms of on the criminal case, how I'm going to take that and how am I going to take that that argument, which could be very well synthesized into what you hear from the prosecutor when they're making their opening statements and then ultimately their summations. It's really going back to whether there was an intent in these officers, what was going on at this in this situation, and as was stated previously, it's going to be difficult since all these officers are going to be tried together. Will one of these officers be prejudiced by the facts and the evidence that's coming forth in this case as against the other? But I think with that statement, you see a window into what's going to be happening in this case, probably in a civil case down the line, and also certain arguments or terms, the right to breathe, and that was taken away from George Floyd, that may pop up and percolate inside the opening statement of the prosecution and the summation.
All right, Imran and Dina, before break, what do you think about that? I mean, based off what Imran said, this is something that's going to be very complicated here when we do get to trial.
Yes, it sounds like they're going to have a civil suit afterwards, which his right to breathe with a wrongful death situation. He was saying the right to breathe, but basically that was what he was saying, was that they wrongfully killed him. And in a civil suit, the burden is different. The prosecutors need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil suit, it is preponderance of the evidence. And it's funny, I'm going to bring up O.J. Simpson again, but that's why the Goldberg family prevailed in a civil suit, but did not in the criminal trial. The civil suit bar is lower, and they are both going to happen. The criminal first, as we know. It sounds like they have already made some significant rulings here, the judge.
All right, Dina, Imran, thank you both. We got to take our first break right now on Law and Crime. When we come back, more top headlines of today's legal story. Stay with us after this. And welcome back to Law and Crime. We have new video out today from the Philadelphia police department. And this is all surrounding the incident of a Philadelphia police officer who is involved in the death of Walter Wallace Jr. Now, Wallace was a man who was shot by police while holding a knife last week during a confrontation in Philadelphia. The video that came out was very trivial because it was, of course, very graphic. It was grabbed from the officer's body cam footage. Let's listen to the district attorney making a decision on to whether or not to release that footage.
People give a vote. Tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people give their vote, and they give it for nothing, for something. And what they give it for is a government that will provide protection from pandemics, sometimes protection from foreign invasion. But they also give it for a government that will protect them when their child, who has mental illness and cannot be blamed for that, needs intervention from government of some source. Well, I am part of government, and I don't think there's any dispute that in this particular situation, when a mother was trying to get help with a situation involving her son, who is blameless for having mental illness, that when she did that, government failed because her son was killed within a minute of government's arrival. As a part of government, I apologize for that. I think what occurred here is heartbreaking. I know that the mayor feels that way. I've heard him on that. I know the police commissioner feels that way. I've heard her on that. And I think everyone who has even seen the video that has been available on social media from a civilian knows that this is truly a heartbreaking situation. So the question then is, how does government not fail now? What can we do now not to fail? Well, I was not involved in any of the discussions about these new programs, policies, trainings. I applaud the city, the police commissioner, the Department of Behavioral Health for their attempts to immediately wrestle with this, for some of those efforts even predating when this occurred. I think that is a positive step in the right direction towards protecting us. When the issue of the release of this body-worn camera video was raised, I also think that the mayor, his staff, the police commissioner, and I and my staff decided we were going to give this family protection this time. We were going to listen to them. And this is crucial. We were going to listen to them when they said, I want these audio tapes released, and I want video up to a certain point, but this is my child, and I don't want video after that point released to the public. I want the public to see absolutely everything without blurring anything for the portion that we believe is appropriate, but I do not want this other part to be shared with the public at this time.
Okay, so this is interesting because you hear the district attorney talking about how they're releasing this video in an agreement with the Wallace family. Now, that's something that you don't always get here, Imran. So talk a little bit about how the family is, urging this video to be released in obviously accordance with the police department, and how the investigation is still ongoing on this. So they don't really want the officers and people to see this video and automatically blame the officers and charge the officers with murder. They said that they want, the fairness of this to come out of this, not necessarily just what is shown in this video.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I mean, you have a family who's been through a really tragic situation, and you're living in the day where there's video. People take videos on their telephones. People take, you get videos now from body cam footage, and you have a district attorney's office and a district attorney who's really taking into consideration the desires and wishes of the family. He's treating it with extreme caution, with sympathy. And, I'm a former prosecutor, and that's one thing, that's a job of a prosecutor when dealing with the family of someone who has been a victim of a egregious or heinous incident where a death is involved or something sensitive of that nature. You always have to think about the victim and the victim's family and be sensitive to their desires. And that's what we see here. We see the district attorney who has evidence, who feels that the public should see or be afforded the right to see this evidence. But he's being very sympathetic or cautious, and also deferring to what the family's desires and wishes are. And I think it's fascinating that we have the family who are urging the public and also the prosecutors who are handling this case and investigating this case to have some sort of open mind while they're looking at the evidence. They're not urging for murder charges. In fact, they're going back and they're saying that this is an incident that may have stemmed from the fact that this police department was perhaps underfunded, undereducated in terms of the training for their officers, and under-equipped. And when we look at this situation, we look at the video and analyze this specific incident, we realize that these officers did not have a less deadly means in terms of handling this situation. And by that, I mean in terms of equipment. They didn't have tasers. They didn't have a means to really take down this situation and de-escalate it without using deadly force. Whether deadly force was appropriate in this case, I'm not opining on that. But they weren't equipped with something lesser in terms of their firearm. And I think the family is honing in on that. They're saying that this police department or these police officers needed more training and they needed more equipment.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting you mentioned that. We're going to show you that video now. I want to warn you, it can be kind of graphic, so be aware of that. Let's play the body cam video again. This was released just earlier.
Put the knife down. Put the knife down. Put the knife down. Man, move. Put the knife down. Get him. Put the knife down. Shoot him. Move, move, move. Put the knife.
All right, so a lot going on in that video. Obviously, you can hear a woman in the background saying that Wallace was mental. You hear the police officers repeatedly telling Wallace to put the knife down. You hear the shots being fired, a number of them. Not sure exactly how many actually hit Wallace, but just looking at that video, it itself is a tragic incident. We can see that from the video. Dina, weigh in on your thoughts about this whole thing in general, the video being released, and of course, as Imran was talking about, how the family is asking not to really vilify these police officers, but is taking this stance on the fact that they were not properly trained and they didn't have the equipment on them to handle this in an alternative way.
Absolutely. I think the family has a right in this situation. It was good to have the video released. Everybody needs a complete and accurate picture of exactly what happened. And it is also true that the police were called to a situation that really wasn't warranted for the police. I mean, this is the classic argument that a lot of the defund the police arguments are, which is not defund the police department, but give funding to officers or social workers that can better handle situations like this. This was a mental health situation. And an officer only came equipped with a gun. I mean, that is not the tool that is going to solve this problem. Another thing that came out, I mean, there was a 911 call. That is why police officers were involved. And now they're realizing that it's good to have a crisis person on that 911 call to better able even handle the situation the moment the phone call is made. So from that, and this police department actually does have crisis teams, but one was not sent in this situation, probably because there's not enough funding for it. So we see over and over again, the wrong tool is brought to the wrong situation. And that is what happened here. I think that is what the families acknowledge. I'm sure they have dealt with a mental illness for their son for years, and they understand in some ways the difficult position these particular officers were in because they are a symptom of the problem. These officers themselves did not create the problem.
All right, Dina, Imran, thank you both. We're going to switch gears now. We got another story we want to talk about. The man convicted in the kidnapping of rapper Tekashi, 69, was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Now, the judge announced the sentence for 33-year-old Anthony Ellison, who has been incarcerated in Manhattan. Ellison kidnapped Tekashi, 69, in July of 2018. He slashed the face of another man that left him permanently disfigured. Now, the judge called Ellison cruel and vicious for his actions. Prosecutors say that Ellison was the leader of a faction of a gang called the 9 Trey Gangsta Bloods. He turned into a cooperator during all of this, talking about Tekashi, 69, and was released from prison for giving out info. Now, a big part of this is that he was critiqued for cooperating in this. Now that the man convicted of kidnapping him was convicted, Imran, what's your take on this whole thing? A little bit of a confusing situation here, but I guess, we are getting someone sentenced here to prison.
Yeah, and if you know the whole world of Tekashi 6ix9ine and the hip hop scene here in New York, I'm in New York. Listen, he famously portrayed or I would say spotlighted the Bloods in one of his rap videos, and that really brought Tekashi 6ix9ine in one of his really famous songs to the spotlight. And everyone here in New York in law enforcement, even I'm a former prosecutor and also on the defense side, they're really curious the fact that you had this particular hip hop artist featured very prominently in his video, real members of the Blood. So I find it very ironic that now a member of that same Blood crew is being convicted and sentenced on a kidnapping of Tekashi 6ix9ine. But, I know Judge Paul Engelmeyer. I appeared before him, and he is a very thoughtful, very thorough judge in the SDNY. And I believe, given the nature of the charges here, given the fact that there's a violent crime associated with this individual, and that would be the slashing and verified gang ties, I think 24 years is something which Judge Engelmeyer used his discretion and perhaps was appropriate given under the circumstances and the facts in this case.
All right, Imran and Dina, coming out to you. 24 years is the sentence of what Ellison got. What are your thoughts and your reaction to that?
It sounds about right. And it sounded also like the judge was compelled with the fact that the slashing that he mentioned, went from his chin to his jaw. And it was so gruesome that they didn't even show the jury the pictures of this. And he found that act in itself kind of showed like a depravity with the defendant. And that was part of his sentencing of why he got such a harsh sentence.
All right, Dina, Imran, thank you both. We're taking another break right now. When we come back, plenty more top headlines of today. Stay with us after this.
Los Angeles Fire Department firefighter Frank Aguilar, we learned from Mexican authorities, may have been the victim of a violent kidnapping in Baja California. I want to say very clearly to anybody who would kidnap a member of our fire department that this is a member not just of our city government family, but of our community here in Los Angeles. We will work tirelessly to make sure that Frank is returned safely, that this is somebody who has put his life on the line for us, and we will do everything in our power, working together with the Mexican government, through our State Department, as the City of Los Angeles, and with our local Consul General from Mexico, to ensure that law enforcement in Mexico has whatever support it needs. And if this message gets to anybody who would dare kidnap an Angelino who serves the people of Los Angeles, let him go and make sure that he is able to safely return to our city and to his family.
All right, well, that was the mayor of Los Angeles discussing the disappearance of a firefighter. We're talking about 48-year-old Francisco Aguilar and a sad ending to that search. 2 months later, his body was discovered in Mexico. Now, authorities believe that he was kidnapped there after being reported missing by his family. He failed to check in with them. They thought that was off and abnormal. So when they didn't hear from him, they asked someone else to check on him, only to discover that the condo that he was in had been left in shambles. 2 people were arrested in connection to this case after police said that they had bank cards in Aguilar's name. A very sad situation here, but obviously, I guess a good development being that they have arrested 2 people here. Imran, what are your thoughts on this case?
Yeah, no, I think this is indicative of sort of the cross-border crime that occurs in this area. We know that the border area of Mexico, this is no secret, is somewhat of a dangerous place. We have cartels that are operating in the area. We have drug activity in that area, and the Mexican government and the federales, which is essentially the Mexican equivalent of the FBI, have worked tirelessly trying to address the violence in this area and to quell it. But this is something which is indicative of essentially the crime that may occur. I'm not saying this is cartel related. I don't know that. I don't think there's any evidence of that as far as we know now. But we have an unfortunate circumstance where someone who is a firefighter, someone who is a civil servant here in our country, has gone to his vacation home, it appears, and has been a victim of a heinous crime. I think this was probably a robbery-esque situation here where, unfortunately, we now learn that this individual has been killed during the process. But as you say, at least on a bright note, there is an arrest here, and hopefully justice can be done. And I know that the FBI and the federales are working together. And when there is an interest of a U.S. citizen who has been unfortunately a victim of a crime, I know that there will be involvement north of the border in terms of whatever prosecution may occur south of the border.
Absolutely. And Dina, one of the details that came out is that Aguilar tried to get to run from these 2 suspects here. And basically he was fighting back or, trying to save himself, but they ended up shooting him and putting him, I guess, in a van. That's where later his body was found. But it's really an incredible story because you think of this is a guy that was in the fire department for 20 years. So obviously, he did everything he could to try to save himself. And as Imran said, hopefully we'll get some justice here with the different authorities working on this.
Yes, and it's amazing to me how many details we actually do know, which means that probably one of those couples is cooperating, because the fact that we know all that, it sounded like the woman involved kind of lured him out with maybe a possible date or meeting. And then when he saw that there was a man and realized this was a coordinated kind of attack on him, is when he tried to flee. And as you say, he got shot and put in the van. And the fact that they have found the credit cards, they have this level of detail about the crime itself, the fact that they have his remains, shows how much probably the U.S. government, the FBI, did do an investigation with coordinating with Mexico. They did an incredible job, actually, at getting to the bottom of this. You would think sometimes if crime happens in a foreign government, you may never know the answer. Well, here we know the answer. We know the details. There will definitely be a conviction. And hopefully that is some solace, not only to this family, but to all Americans who are traveling abroad. Just because you're abroad, your government isn't going to forget you. And here, especially, as the mayor, Eric Garcetti, said, he was a member of the government family and they treated him that way.
Great point. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Imran. We're going to switch gears right now. A verdict is out for Kelsey Thomas's bench retrial. Thomas was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the death of her 5-year-old daughter. Now, you'll recall that Thomas's first trial was about a year ago. That ended in a hung jury, though. And this is all surrounding her daughter, who was found hanging by the neck from a pair of pajama pants in her closet. The legs of the pants were tied to a dowel rod, and Chloe, the daughter's head, was caught in the pants. Thomas had said that Chloe attempted to make a swing in the closet and accidentally strangled herself. And that, of course, had raised some suspicions. After the first trial was declared a retrial because of the hung jury, there was a 2-week bench trial that happened last month. Well, the judge just convicted Thomas now and ended up giving her a lesser charge. So first off, let's talk about the charges here. She's getting the involuntary manslaughter here. What are your thoughts on that, Imran?
Well, Angelica, we had this bench trial, which was a retrial, as you say, of the original jury trial, which ended up with a hung jury. So this judge had a certain discretion, but she also had a lot of facts before her. She didn't have the evidence that came in only pursuant to the bench trial, but she also had the luxury, if you will, of taking the record of the underlying jury trial and having all that evidence as consideration before her. The judge didn't convict on the top count. She did convict on a lesser included, but however way you put it, this defendant is going to jail. Some may say this is a sign of justice for this young child who unfortunately met her end all too early.
Absolutely. And we want to play you the medical examiner during direct examination talking about the signs of strangulation here, because as I mentioned, there were suspicions around how this all happened. And in the first trial, they were saying that investigators did not believe this was an accident. Let's listen.
What are your typical findings in conducting an autopsy in a strangulation?
If one were to just describe a strangulation, a manual strangulation, in other words, a person taking hands to the neck of another, the typical findings that we would look for would be petechiae. The petechiae are most often seen on the surfaces of the eye and eyelid, around the eye and on the face, and in some cases, seems like also in children, those petechiae will go even onto the side of the face or the scalp. Some doesn't be, the TBI don't have to be there, and again, they're non-specific, but they are a hallmark of strangulation. We look for injury of the neck. With manual strangulation, those might be bruises. The bruises might take the shape of finger pads. They might be elongated because of the hand wrapping the neck. We sometimes see fingernail marks, little curved abrasions, or straight little flat abrasions due to either the perpetrator or the victim's fingers having scratched the skin. So bruises and abrasions are common. Internally, we look for hemorrhage of the neck. There are strap muscles. Those are the muscles that are in the front of the neck that allow for not only some movement of the head upon the neck, but also speaking and so forth. Those muscles in the front of the neck often have injury, and the injury can be very subtle. Even with a violent strangulation, there's not always physical injury. But we look for it, and we look for it carefully because it can be subtle in small amounts or unevenly distributed.
All right, so that was the medical examiner there talking more specifically about the signs of strangulation. We have more of that we want to play for you. We got to take a break right now. More about Kelsey Thomas's trial after this.
Is it problematic, doctor, that you conduct this autopsy, on the same day as the autopsy, you tell officers what your findings are and what you think the problems with those findings are, that the only subsequent action that investigators take is to interrogate Kelsey Thomas and feed her the information that you told them the findings needed to match? Is that problematic?
The transcript that I read simply said that the autopsy findings did not fit with the story as given. And that's true.
Dr. Cavalier, were you aware that investigators were telling Kelsey Thomas what your findings were and that her story needed to match your findings?
No.
Is that problematic?
I don't think so.
You don't think it's problematic if investigators are telling the suspect, this is what the medical reports say happened, and so if we're going to believe your story, they need to match these findings, and telling her what the findings are? That's not problematic to you?
They did not tell her what the findings were.
How do you know that?
Well, I read the transcript.
Okay.
All right, so that was the medical examiner there on cross-examination. Now we want to play you the defense pathologist's testimony here. This, of course, we're talking about Kelsey Thomas's trial, the woman who was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the death of her 5-year-old daughter. Let's listen.
So is it fair to say that you are in disagreement with Dr. Cavalier's opinion that the cause of death of Chloe Chandler was manual strangulation?
Yes, sir.
And before we get into that detail, Dr. Young, do you disagree with Dr. Cavalier's autopsy report in its entirety, or just her ultimate opinion that this was a manual strangulation?
I'm in agreement with what she saw at the autopsy, what she described in the report, and what she photographed. I'm in complete agreement with that. The only difference here is the conclusion.
All right, let's talk about this with our guests, Imran Ansari and Dina here with us. Imran, I'm coming out to you first. This is a tragic story. It's really hard to hear. It's hard to listen. You know, we covered this trial. Then there was the retrial, which we also covered here on Law and Crime. Either way, when you look at it, this story is tragic. Listening to this and talking about what's happening here with the involuntary manslaughter charge, what are your thoughts on that? And then let's look forward and talk about sentencing, because we know she's facing a max of 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the judge, in my opinion, looked at the evidence here and found that it wasn't quite, it didn't pass muster in terms of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, in terms of satisfying the elements to make the first-degree murder charge that she was charged with. And the evidence, really how it came through at trial, ended up being a battle of the experts, if you will. And you find the testimony that you just played in terms of the ME, the medical examiner, who testified on the people's case, on the prosecution's case, as to the findings, and then also the defense put on their own medical expert who really refuted. There was some agreement. You heard some concessions that in terms of the mechanism of death, but really put forth the argument in terms of forensic evidence, medical evidence, that this may have been an accident rather than an intentional strangulation, which the prosecution was trying to hit home and relied on the ME examiner's report. And I think also something that the defense pointed out was the fact that the investigators from NYPD, from the police department and law enforcement in that case, really relied on the findings from the ME and whether that was the way that medical examiner's report, how it played into the investigation to this case, and whether that was somehow tainted. But it really turned out to be a battle of the experts, and you find the judge here finding that the evidence did not rise to the level of proving beyond a reasonable doubt the first-degree murder charge, but rather the lesser included, which, as you say, has a 5-year sentence. And I think, listen, if we're going to speculate or see what this judge, as to what this judge will do, I think she will give the maximum under this charge, just given the nature of in terms of the victim, and also the fact that it took 2 trials to get us here, and there is some public outcry. And I think that the involuntary manslaughter charge is somewhat of a gift, if in my opinion, and the 5 years at a max would be something that the judge would, in her discretion, sentence this defendant to.
Interesting. And, you know, Dina, one of the things that was obviously required for a first-degree murder charge would have been the premeditation. And the judge is obviously saying that they didn't find that. So I'm wondering if you can weigh in on that. And then again, talk a little bit about the sentencing. She's already served 2 years. So I do want to mention that as well, Dina.
Yes, you know, and I spoke about this case a few weeks ago when I was just starting, and I found myself tuning in to see if they had a verdict yet, because it was a very close call, and I really couldn't figure out which way this judge was going to go. I think the judge went the right way. There was really zero evidence that there was premeditation here at all. Perhaps there was a phone call to her mom a year earlier asking that she take Kelsey in because she was having trouble, you know, juggling it all. But that clearly wasn't showing murder intent. And I also found that the 2 medical examiners both gave very credible testimonies. I really think this could have gone either way. So the judge, having found the fact that she did not intend to kill her daughter, but that she did kill her daughter, was probably the right call. We still don't know how it happened, and the judge didn't have to ultimately decide how it happened. You know, whether or not, you know, how the strangulation occurred, we're really never going to know. And this was such an unclear body of evidence that the judge had to decide on. I think that this lesser charge was the right one, because something happened here, something that seemed, you know, above this idea of the child creating the swing and, you know, dying that way, but not much more than that. And so this idea of only 5 years sounds about right. The fact that she had 2, like you said, she's already served the 2, and maybe she'll be out in good behavior. You know, that all sounds about right for the evidence that was presented in this case.
Dina, I got to cut you off here. All right, Dina Dahl and Imran Ansari, thank you both for joining us today. After this, we'll be back to our regular programming on Law and Crime. Thank you.